Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we'll be picking up right where we left off with the Protestant Reformation. Now, so far, our focus has been on Eurasia, attempting to tell this sort of grand unifying history of the world over the course of just a couple hours that can explain why some civilizations thrived and why others failed. And the main idea is this connection between technological growth and the political system a society has. That authoritarianism tends to breed very extractive institutions, which perpetuate authoritarianism and also strangle growth because growth serves as a threat to the stability of the ruler's regime. We saw this in Asia and we saw it in the Middle East, where some of the most advanced civilizations on the earth ended up stagnating and, in certain respects, actually technologically and socially regressing because of their powerful government's hostility to technological change. And we also saw, or talked very briefly, about how imperial institutions in Europe attempted to do the same thing, but they were not able to control it because the highly fractured nature of the landscape naturally bred many small nation states, and that in turn undermined any attempt to unify it all under one large hegemonic empire. And the crucial break came with the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation essentially kills off the last remnant of the Roman Empire in certain parts of Europe. Now, one thing that I want to note is Protestantism, when it first emerges, is highly intolerant. Now, it's not highly intolerant relative to Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Islam or any other religion, but it is intolerant. Like all faiths of that time, there was an assumption that every state, every society had to have a single religion around which that society would be unified. This was a basic assumption of essentially political theory, political philosophy at that time. But as we saw, Protestantism, by promoting essentially a more decentralized church, naturally lent itself to a more decentralized political ethic in general, and it would end up becoming associated with the cause of republicanism in several nations, all of which would go on to be highly prosperous, and two of which, Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, would go on to become major European great powers and major colonial empires. See, another thing I want to note is that just because some countries went further with creating inclusive institutions in their own country, that does not mean that they primarily implemented inclusive institutions in the nations that they would conquer. And this too is going to be part of our story moving forward. We're actually not going to talk much about the British Empire in India and Africa, but when I tell you about communism and about Latin America, that'll come up again. There's also one small detail. I was hesitant to even spend any time on this here, but I had intended to include it in the last video. When I was talking about the role of printing and of the desire to circulate more Bibles among the Protestants, one thing to note is that the Presbyterian Church in Scotland had this major push to educate everybody. There was a belief that every man ought to be able to read in order that they could read the Bible. But the thing is, if somebody is able to read the Bible, they're going to be able to read other things too. And because this is a culture that promotes education, it's actually going to favor education in general. Now, again, it may be very religiously repressive. Scotland borders on a theocracy in this time, but they're going to do things like allow common folk to sit in on university lectures. They're even going to promote education for women as well. It's not done to the same extent as it is for men, but there is going to be a much higher literacy rate in a place like Scotland than in a place like, say, Spain. This ends up leading directly to that Scottish Enlightenment that I told you about with Adam Smith. Over the course of the 1700s and the 1800s, Scotland is arguably going to be, per capita, the most innovative nation on Earth. Now, Scotland also has like a fourth or maybe even less of the population of England at that time. It's a small country. And so many other countries end up having perhaps a larger impact overall. But Winston Churchill himself once said that of all the small nations of this earth, perhaps only the ancient Greeks surpassed the Scots in their contribution to mankind. This is not a coincidence. The reason why the Scots are going to become so productive in philosophy, in science, in especially importantly in the Industrial Revolution, practical engineering and invention, is that they have a capitalist and generally more politically free society. Once Scotland is fused with England in the Act of Union, once it becomes Great Britain, they have a constitutional monarchy. They have elections and their own parliament. The Scots essentially lived in a society that was the closest thing to what Greco-Roman civilization had for a long time, and something that we wouldn't really see fully mature until it spread across the ocean and became America. But this emphasis on education, which went along with this democratic principle, also played a major role. When you think of the various great peoples of the earth, various cultures that had a very outsized impact on scientific development, Greeks, Scots, and Jews, one thing that they all had in common was that they all had this emphasis on educating as many of their people as they could. Judaism is going to have the same concept that every male has to be able to read the Torah. And with the Greeks, I don't know that they ever really tried to make it universal, but there was an ideal bound up in their concept of the gymnasium that a good citizen should have a cultivated body and mind. Now, I told you we were moving our focus over to Latin America. And so let's get into that now. So elsewhere in the world, revolutions tended to fail or to be delayed because of extractive institutions. And in the age of liberalism, in this long period that I think you could loosely date as being maybe 1650 or 1700 up to around 1850, in the age of liberalism, nations attempted copying the United States, but they mostly failed at this. I want you to think back to C.G.P. Gray. You remember how he laid out this argument for why revolutions usually fail to change the social structure. When a revolution happens, it can change the keys. Now, he's giving you a very simplified model of it, but in general, unless the underlying mode of production of society is altered, unless there is some major reform effort or some kind of mass destruction that changes the keys to power, what you're going to have is ultimately the same basic incentive structure. The same people are crucial for gaining and holding power. Or, well, literally, the individual people may change, but the role that they play in society does not change. Like an office that's simply been filled with a different office holder. And so the natural order of that society is going to reassert itself. Because whoever plays the political game the best ends up ruling, and playing the political game means pandering to your keys. And as CGP Grey noted, oftentimes revolution can actually reinforce that vicious cycle of extraction, because when it destroys economic productivity, it rewards political rent seeking, it rewards parasitical behavior, and it often makes the society even more dependent on raw resource extraction. Manufacturing is difficult. Manufacturing requires a great deal of social stability. It requires developed markets. It requires essentially a society that is geared towards cooperation. If you take those things away, your manufacturing is going to buckle, and what you're left with is agriculture and mining, wealth that is dug out of the ground. Now, in Latin America, the crucial flaw that's going to prevent them from developing societies like the US is their caste system. Now, let's go back to that original map I showed you. Now, recall that and of course, I can't go into very fine detail on every single country, but we can kind of broadly carve Latin America up into a few regions. You have the Caribbean, you have Central America. I was going to call it Mexico. It actually was all Mexico at one point. You have the Andes. You have Brazil. That's a Portuguese colony, but it's essentially the same kind of society as the Spanish colonies. And then you have what's often called the Southern Cone, that rich and white part of Latin America. Now, let's say that Venezuela and Colombia, they're really more part of the Caribbean world than anything else. Now, in Central America, you have very large developed civilizations, Aztecs, Mayans. In the Andes, you have very large developed civilizations, Incas. In both of these places, you have a very large native population that is already used to being ruled by other people. And when the Spanish invade, they're essentially just going to co-opt the systems that already exist. One large reason why Hernán Cortés is able to conquer the Aztecs so easily is because the Aztecs' enemies flipped to his side. The Aztecs were hated by all of their neighbors because they tormented their neighbors through constant war and sacrifice. And so Cortés essentially offered a better deal in the moment to local elites who are outside of the Aztecs' governing coalition. And after they take power, they're not going to completely reshape the social structure. And unlike with colonization in North America, they're not going to push the Indians further back. In fact, the United States tended to want to civilize and control the Indian population, but the Indians themselves would leave. Even the agriculturalists didn't have much in the way of fixed capital or, very complex institutions that would tie them to a particular plot of land. In North America, even when people wanted to conquer Indians and rule over them, that was the goal with the founding of Jamestown in Virginia, to conquer the Indians and use them as slaves. In North America, they couldn't do it. It just wasn't possible to secure a forced labor workforce like that through warfare. But in Mesoamerica and the Andes, it was. And the way the Spanish are going to rule this place is that they essentially cut the existing elites in on the deal. They're going to give titles of Spanish nobility to Aztec and Inca noblemen. They're going to marry Aztec and Inca wives. We actually know who the living heir to the throne of the Aztec Empire is And he's a white man that lives in Spain, just from generation after generation of breeding with the Spanish. But the Spanish, in some sense, they don't really create an empire there at all. They just take over an existing empire and then tie it into a broader network. And these colonies are, to a large extent, going to be run like franchises of Spain. They're largely autonomous at the start. Now, in the eastern part of Latin America, in the Caribbean and in Brazil, their social system is going to revolve around slavery. And the slavery here is far more developed than it is in the South. In the South, the slave population numbers, I think, maybe 1/3 of the population as of the time of the Civil War. On many Caribbean islands, the slave population is going to be 90%, 95%, or even higher. The vast majority of slaves that get imported to the New World are being imported into Brazil. The South is a slave society, but it's more of a hybrid of inclusive and extractive institutions. And this is something we will come back to at the very end of the class. But in the Caribbean and Brazil, it's pure extraction. And the big thing that happens in both of these places is you wind up with an ethnic caste system where one race of people rules over another race of people. And the only part of Spanish America where this doesn't become true, they're going to do this in the Philippines too, by the way. That was also a Spanish possession. But the one place where that doesn't become true is in the Southern Cone. There are other major differences between Spanish and British colonial society as well. So in Spanish culture, for example, instead of having this idiotic one-drop rule where people are considered completely British or completely Black or completely Indian or whatever other group they are, in the Spanish colonies, they're going to have gradations. They have a very complex system that they call Casta, where based on your percentage of each ethnic group, that sorts you into your own unique category with your own unique set of privileges and obligations. They live under something that you might compare to Jim Crow, but it's a way more complicated form of Jim Crow. The system is also going to be fluid in a way that it's not in America. This will sound really goofy. It's meant to be goofy. You could actually buy whiteness in the Spanish Empire. If you paid enough money to the king, he would give you a permit that would make you legally white. But this kind of thing is going to be used to stabilize the Spanish regime. Because there are gradations, this helps to disrupt any attempt to organize some kind of mass revolt. A person might be lower down the hierarchy than other people. They might, for example, be a brown-skinned mestizo who's a mixture of Indian and white, but at least they're not an Indio, a full-blooded Indian. People are going to be sorted into ranks where, except for at the very bottom, there are always people below them who they are going to have some kind of stake in suppressing. It essentially encourages the serfs, or peons, as they call them in Latin America, to actively collaborate with the system by giving them their own subsystem to lord over. Land ownership in Latin America is likewise going to be heavily concentrated. In America, we call this plantation class the planters. In Latin America, they're going to be called hacendados. An hacienda is a Spanish plantation. And the hacendados own just about everything. This is a world where the Indians, even after the mass death from plague, the Indians are still so numerous that the countryside is still very densely populated. Most of the land was already owned by nobility. The only thing that's changed is who, holds the title now. In other places, this is going to be newly imposed on them. But in general, a small group of large landowners control most of the territory, and they control most of the people as a sort of equivalent to serfs. They have a very great deal of power over the personal lives of their tenant farmers. If you're familiar with sharecropping, you can think of it as being a lot like sharecropping. And this is going to cause a lot of problems when Latin America rebels. So, the United States is the first independent nation in the New World. It's the first of the European colonies to separate from its homeland. And this directly inspires the French Revolution, and it also directly inspires the revolutions in Latin America. The Revolution of Mexico, the Revolution of Gran Colombia, and of Peru, Bolivia with Simón Bolívar. This man, if you're not familiar with him, he is the George Washington of South America. It inspires José de San Martín down in Argentina. And for the most part, they are operating on the same ideology as the founding fathers, and they're trying to create the same sort of political system as the founding fathers. These Spanish revolutionaries, whether Bolivar in the middle, San Martin in the south, I don't know if it's as fair to say of Father Hidalgo in Mexico, but you might say he's almost more like a proto-socialist. These various revolutionary leaders, they all are classical liberals. Many of them are going to be Freemasons, just like many of our founding fathers are. And they all try to create either federal republics or, in the case of Mexico, constitutional monarchies. But the problem is they have a very oligarchical economy. And that means that one privileged class of hacendados is going to have all the political power in the new federal republic. It's going to be inherently anti-democratic. And when you combine that with this bizarre caste system that separates people into many different types, but also gives them many different conflicting rights, that's going to be perfect fuel for endless sectarian conflict. Any group of oligarchs that wants to is going to be able to launch a coup or launch a revolt from the countryside by essentially bribing certain segments of the public. You have very few keys to power at the top level, so these countries are going to tend to become very repressive. And yet, below those top keys to power, you have like an infinity of other keys. And the main thing that unifies them is some kind of ethnic identity more so than a class consciousness. You get a society that more or less stays in a constant state of like race war, tied in with these very violent oscillations between populism and reactionary elitism that are both led for the most part, by the upper class. Latin America is almost from the get-go going to descend into endless civil war. And it ends up oh, by the way, the fella down here, that's Father Hidalgo, the George Washington of Mexico. And so their attempt at American style federalism, their attempt to intentionally imitate the United States, is going to fail spectacularly to the point that their own countries collapse.